The year was 39 AD, and the cobblestones of Rome's Suburra district echoed with the footsteps of a young man whose beauty would soon captivate the most dangerous emperor in history. His name was Marcus Lepidus, not the famous triumvir, distant relative who had fallen from grace when his family backed the wrong political faction. At 17, he possessed the kind of ethereal handsomeness that seemed to belong more to the realm of gods than mortals. Marcus had golden hair that caught the Mediterranean sun like spun silk, eyes the color of summer sky, and features so delicate they could have been carved by Praxiteles himself. But it was more than mere physical beauty that set him apart. There was an intelligence in his gaze, a quiet dignity in his bearing that suggested noble blood, despite his current circumstances. The young man had been reduced to working as a scribe in the markets, copying documents for merchants and writing letters for the illiterate. His family's fall from grace had left him with nothing but his education and his striking appearance. He lived in a cramped apartment above a bakery, surviving on bread crusts and whatever coins he could earn with his stylus and parchment. It was during one of these ordinary working days that Marcus's life would change forever. Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, was making one of his frequent unannounced tours through Rome's poorer districts, partly to gauge public opinion and partly to indulge his voyeuristic fascination with the lives of common citizens. If you're already intrigued by this tale of imperial obsession, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. You won't believe how twisted this story becomes. The emperor's gaze Caligula was 27 years old and had been emperor for 2 years, long enough for his initial popularity to curdle into fear and resentment. The young ruler, who had once been beloved for his generosity and charm, had revealed himself to be cruel, unpredictable, and possibly insane. His mood swings were legendary, his cruelty creative, and his sexual appetites both voracious and indiscriminate. On this particular afternoon, the emperor was traveling through the Suburra in a simple litter, accompanied by only a small guard detail. He was observing the daily life of his subjects when his eyes fell upon Marcus, who was seated at a small table copying a contract for a wine merchant. The effect was immediate and profound. Caligula ordered his litter to stop and spent several minutes simply staring at the young scribe. Marcus, unaware of the imperial attention, continued his work with careful concentration, his beautiful hands moving gracefully across the parchment. "Bring him to me," Caligula commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had never been refused anything. The Praetorian guards approached Marcus with the casual brutality that characterized all imperial interactions with common citizens. They seized him without explanation, scattering his writing materials and terrifying the wine merchant who had been his customer. "What is your name?" Caligula asked when Marcus was brought before his litter. "Marcus Lepidus Caesar," the young man replied, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. The emperor's eyes lit up with interest. "Lepidus, are you related to my dear departed brother-in-law?" Marcus understood immediately that his life hung in the balance of his answer. The Marcus Aemilius Lepidus that Caligula referred to had been married to the emperor's sister Drusilla, but had later been executed for treason after allegedly plotting against the throne. "A distant cousin, Caesar. My family has always been loyal to Rome and to you." It was a careful answer that acknowledged the connection, while distancing himself from the traitor's fate. Caligula studied the young man's face for a long moment, then smiled an expression that those who knew him had learned to fear. "The imperial summons you will come with me," Caligula declared. "I have need of a new secretary, and you appear to be educated." It was not a request, but a command, and Marcus understood that refusal was not an option. He was bundled into the imperial litter, leaving behind his meager possessions and his simple life forever. As they traveled toward the Palatine Hill, Caligula peppered him with questions about his education, his family, and his circumstances. Marcus answered carefully, presenting himself as a loyal citizen, fallen on hard times, rather than a potential threat to imperial security. He spoke of his education in rhetoric and philosophy, his skill with languages, and his desperate need for employment. What he did not mention was his growing awareness of the emperor's intense scrutiny. The way Caligula's eyes lingered on his face and form with an interest that went far beyond professional necessity. The imperial palace was a revelation to someone who had been living in poverty. Marble corridors stretched in every direction, decorated with priceless art and filled with the constant bustle of servants, courtiers, and officials. Marcus was assigned quarters in the servants' wing, modest, but luxurious compared to his recent accommodations. His duties as imperial secretary began immediately. Caligula dictated letters, proclamations, and personal correspondence with the rapid-fire intensity of a man whose mind never stopped working. Marcus proved himself capable and intelligent, quickly learning the emperor's preferences and anticipating his needs, but it became increasingly clear that Caligula's interest in his new secretary went beyond his professional capabilities. The dangerous attraction within days of Marcus's arrival at the palace. The emperor began finding excuses to spend time alone with his beautiful secretary. Private dictation sessions stretched for hours, with Caligula seeming more interested in studying Marcus's face than in the content of his correspondence. The emperor would ask personal questions that had nothing to do with work, about Marcus's childhood, his dreams, his thoughts on poetry and philosophy. He began giving the young man gifts, fine clothing, jewelry, books that were far beyond what any secretary should expect to receive. Marcus found himself walking a dangerous tightrope. He needed to be grateful enough to avoid offending the emperor, but not so encouraging as to invite unwanted advances. He had heard the stories about Caligula's sexual appetites, his tendency to take what he wanted regardless of consent, and his habit of discarding lovers as casually as he had acquired them. The situation became more precarious when Caligula began insisting that Marcus accompany him to social events. The young secretary found himself attending banquets, theatrical performances, and gladiatorial games at the emperor's side, dressed in fine clothes and treated with a deference that confused and alarmed the court. Whispers began to circulate among the palace staff and courtiers. Some speculated that Marcus was simply the latest in a long line of imperial favorites, who would soon be discarded. Others suggested that the emperor's interest was more serious, noting the care with which he treated the young man and the obvious pleasure he took in his company. This story is about to take an even more shocking turn. Make sure you're subscribed, because what Caligula does next will leave you speechless. The adoption proposal. The crisis came during the Ides of Julius, when Caligula summoned Marcus to his private study for what the young man assumed would be another dictation session. Instead, he found the emperor pacing nervously, his usual confidence replaced by an agitation that was both surprising and alarming. Marcus, Caligula began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I have been thinking about your situation. Your family's fall from grace was unjust, and your current position, while necessary, is beneath your noble birth. Marcus waited silently, unsure where this conversation was leading, but certain that his response would be crucial to his survival. I wish to adopt you as my son, Caligula continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. You would take the name Gaius Julius Caesar, Lepidus, become a member of the imperial family, and inherit a position worthy of your birth and abilities. The proposal was stunning in its implications. Adoption into the imperial family would make Marcus one of the most powerful young men in Rome, with access to wealth, influence, and political opportunities beyond his wildest dreams. But it would also bind him irrevocably to Caligula's fate, making him a target for the emperor's enemies and a participant in whatever madness the future might bring. I am honored beyond words, Caesar, Marcus replied carefully. But surely such an elevation requires careful consideration. The Senate, the people, your advisors, they would need to understand the wisdom of such a decision. Caligula's expression darkened at the suggestion that his will might require external approval. I am emperor, he said coldly. My word is law. The question is not whether others approve, but whether you accept. Marcus understood that he was being offered a choice that was no choice at all. To refuse would be to insult the emperor and invite certain death. To accept would be to enter a world of luxury and danger from which there might be no escape. I accept with gratitude and humility, Caesar, he said, bowing deeply. Caligula's mood shifted instantly, his face lighting up with genuine joy. Excellent. We shall hold the ceremony tomorrow. You will be my son, my heir, my closest companion. The pause before those last words carried implications that made Marcus's blood run cold. The adoption ceremony took place in the palace's grandest hall, with all the pomp and circumstance befitting the elevation of a new member of the imperial family. Senators, courtiers, and foreign dignitaries gathered to witness the unprecedented event of an emperor adopting a distant relative of questionable loyalty. Marcus was dressed in a toga of the finest white silk, bordered with purple to indicate his new status. His hair had been styled in the imperial fashion, and he wore a golden wreath that marked him as a member of the Julian family. The transformation from impoverished scribe to imperial prince was so complete that many of the witnesses barely recognized him. Caligula himself presided over the ceremony, wearing his most elaborate imperial regalia. The emperor spoke eloquently about the importance of family, the need to reward virtue and intelligence, and his desire to ensure the continuation of the Julian line. His words were carefully chosen to present the adoption as a rational political decision rather than the whim of an infatuated ruler. The legal formalities were completed with the efficiency that characterized all Roman bureaucracy. Marcus formally renounced his birth family and accepted Caligula as his father, taking the name Gaius Julius Caesar, Lepidus, and all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. But even as the ceremony proceeded with traditional dignity, those who knew Caligula well could see something unusual in the emperor's behavior. His eyes never left Marcus's face. His voice carried an emotional intensity that went beyond paternal pride, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed the imperial seal on the adoption documents. When the ceremony concluded, and the new prince was presented to the assembled crowd, the applause was polite but subdued. Everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented, but few were certain what it meant for the future of the empire. The new Prince Marcus's elevation to imperial prince brought immediate and dramatic changes to his life. He was moved to luxurious apartments in the imperial wing of the palace, assigned a staff of personal servants, and given access to the vast wealth of the imperial treasury. His education was expanded to include military strategy, statecraft, and the complex protocols of imperial court life. But the most significant change was in his relationship with Caligula. The emperor, no longer constrained by the social barriers that had previously separated them, began to treat Marcus with an intimacy that shocked the court. They dined together privately, attended public events as a pair, and spent long hours in conversation that excluded all others. Caligula showered his adopted son with gifts that went far beyond paternal generosity. Rare books, exquisite jewelry, fine horses, and works of art flowed from the imperial treasury to Marcus's apartments. The emperor seemed to take genuine pleasure in seeing the young man surrounded by luxury, as if Marcus's happiness had become essential to his own. The court watched these developments with growing unease. While adoption was a common practice among Roman nobles, the intensity of Caligula's attachment to his new son was unusual and potentially dangerous. Some courtiers began to whisper that the emperor's feelings for Marcus went beyond those appropriate between father and son. These whispers became louder when Caligula began to show signs of jealousy toward anyone who spent time with Marcus. Guards who were assigned to protect the young prince found themselves reassigned if they seemed too friendly. Senators who attempted to cultivate Marcus's friendship were suddenly excluded from imperial favor. Even servants who worked in Marcus's apartments were carefully vetted to ensure their loyalty to the emperor. The growing obsession, as weeks passed, Caligula's behavior toward Marcus became increasingly possessive and erratic. The emperor would fly into rages if his adopted son was late for their scheduled meetings, demand detailed accounts of how Marcus spent his time when they were apart, and show obvious displeasure when the young man expressed interest in activities that didn't include him. Marcus found himself walking an even more precarious tightrope than before. As an imperial prince, he had wealth and status beyond his previous dreams, but he also lived under constant scrutiny from an emperor whose moods were notoriously unpredictable. He learned to read Caligula's expressions, to anticipate his desires, and to provide the companionship and attention that the emperor craved. The situation was complicated by Marcus's growing awareness that Caligula's feelings for him were not paternal in nature. The emperor's touches lingered too long, his compliments were too intimate, and his jealousy too intense for a normal father-son relationship. Marcus began to understand that he had been adopted not as a son but as something else entirely, something for which Roman society had no acceptable name. The realization filled him with a mixture of fear and disgust, but also with a cold calculation about his survival. He was trapped in the palace, dependent on Caligula's favor for his very life, and surrounded by people who would gladly see him fall if it served their own interests. His only option was to continue playing his role, while hoping that the emperor's attention would eventually turn elsewhere. The situation is about to become even more twisted and dangerous. Stay subscribed and comment below about what you think Caligula will do next. The Festival of Venus. The breaking point came during the Festival of Venus, Rome's celebration of love and beauty. Caligula had planned an elaborate series of events to honor the goddess, including theatrical performances, gladiatorial games, and a grand banquet for the city's elite. Marcus, as the newest member of the imperial family, was expected to play a prominent role in the festivities. The emperor had commissioned special costumes for the occasion, elaborate robes that would present them as divine figures worthy of Venus's favor. When Marcus saw his costume, he understood immediately that something had fundamentally changed in their relationship. The robe was made of silk, so fine it was nearly transparent, dyed in shades of gold and rose that complemented his coloring perfectly. It was cut in a style that emphasized his slender build and graceful movements, more like a woman's garment than traditional male clothing. The accompanying jewelry was equally feminine: delicate gold chains, pearl earrings, and a diadem set with precious stones. "You look beautiful," Caligula breathed when Marcus appeared in the costume, like a god descended from Olympus to grace us with divine beauty. The emperor's own costume was equally elaborate, but unmistakably masculine. Rich purple silk embroidered with gold, a crown of laurel leaves, and jewelry that emphasized his power and authority. The contrast between their appearances was deliberate, and unmistakable. Caligula was presenting himself as the dominant partner in whatever relationship he envisioned between them. The public declaration. The festival of Venus reached its climax with a grand procession through the streets of Rome, followed by ceremonies at the goddess's temple and a banquet for the city's most important citizens. Marcus and Caligula rode together in a golden chariot, their elaborate costumes glittering in the afternoon sun as crowds lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the imperial family. But it was during the temple ceremony that Caligula made the announcement that would shock Rome and seal Marcus's fate forever. Standing before the altar of Venus, with the city's elite as witnesses, the emperor declared his intention to take a new spouse, his own adopted son. "The goddess Venus has blessed me with a companion whose beauty rivals her own," Caligula proclaimed, his voice carrying clearly through the temple. "I have adopted Marcus as my son, but the gods have revealed that our bond transcends the merely familial. I shall take him as my wife, uniting our souls in a marriage blessed by heaven itself." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps of shock echoed through the temple, followed by a stunned silence as the assembled crowd struggled to process what they had heard. Some of the more traditional senators looked physically ill, while others began whispering frantically among themselves. Marcus himself stood frozen in horror, his face pale beneath his cosmetics, as he realized the full extent of Caligula's plans. The emperor had not adopted him as a son but as a prospective bride, using the legal fiction of adoption to create a relationship that could then be transformed into something else entirely. "The wedding will take place in 1 month," Caligula continued, seemingly oblivious to the shock his announcement had caused. "All of Rome will celebrate the union of emperor and empress." The word hung in the air like a sword, its implications clear to everyone present. Caligula was not merely planning to marry another man, he was planning to transform his adopted son into his wife, creating a relationship that defied every Roman tradition and law. The aftermath. The journey back to the palace was conducted in tense silence, with Marcus acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed their chariot. The emperor seemed energized by the announcement, chattering excitedly about wedding plans and the celebrations that would follow. But Marcus could only think about the trap that had closed around him with such devastating completeness. That evening, alone in his apartments, Marcus finally allowed himself to confront the full horror of his situation. He had been adopted into the imperial family only to be transformed into something that was neither son nor daughter, neither man nor woman, but some hybrid creature designed to satisfy an emperor's twisted desires. Escape was impossible. He was too closely watched, too recognizable, and too dependent on imperial protection to survive outside the palace. Resistance would mean death, not just for himself, but potentially for anyone who tried to help him. His only option was to submit to Caligula's will and hope that the emperor's notorious fickleness would eventually lead him to lose interest. But, as Marcus prepared for bed that night, wearing silk nightclothes that were increasingly feminine in their cut and decoration, he understood that his transformation had already begun. Caligula was not simply planning to marry him, as he was. The emperor intended to remake him entirely, turning a young Roman nobleman into something that could serve as an imperial bride. The wedding preparations would begin the next day, and, with them, the systematic destruction of everything that Marcus had been, in order to create what Caligula wanted him to become. The transformation begins the morning after Caligula's shocking announcement. Marcus awoke to find his apartments filled with an army of servants, seamstresses, and beauticians. The emperor had wasted no time in beginning the process of transforming his adopted son into a suitable bride, and every aspect of Marcus's appearance and behavior would be subject to imperial scrutiny and modification. The first change was his wardrobe. The simple togas and tunics that had marked him as a young Roman nobleman were replaced with garments that grew increasingly feminine with each passing day. Silk robes in pastel colors, tunics with flowing sleeves, and undergarments designed to create a more feminine silhouette filled his closets. The transformation was gradual but relentless, each new outfit pushing him further from his original identity. His hair, already long by Roman standards, was styled in increasingly elaborate fashions that emphasized its golden color and silky texture. Perfumes and cosmetics became part of his daily routine, applied by skilled servants who had been trained in the arts of feminine beauty. His nails were manicured and painted, his skin treated with oils and creams that gave it an otherworldly glow. But the most disturbing aspect of the transformation was the way it affected Marcus's sense of self. Each morning, he looked in his mirror and saw someone who was less recognizably himself, and more like the creature Caligula wanted him to become. The young man who had once worked as a scribe in the markets was disappearing, replaced by something that existed only to fulfill an emperor's fantasies. If you're shocked by this transformation, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. This story gets even more twisted as we go deeper into Caligula's madness. The emperor's obsession. Caligula threw himself into the wedding preparations with manic enthusiasm, personally overseeing every detail of Marcus's transformation. The emperor would spend hours each day in Marcus's apartments, directing the servants who dressed and groomed his bride-to-be, offering suggestions for improvements, and expressing his satisfaction with the progress being made. "You grow more beautiful each day," Caligula would murmur, running his fingers through Marcus's carefully styled hair. "Soon you will be the most lovely bride Rome has ever seen." The emperor's behavior during these sessions was both tender and possessive, treating Marcus like a precious object that required constant attention and care. He would adjust the young man's clothing with his own hands, select jewelry that complemented his coloring, and spend long minutes simply staring at the transformation he was creating. But beneath the apparent affection lay a current of threat that Marcus could never forget. Caligula's moods were notoriously unpredictable, and his treatment of previous favorites had often ended in violence or death. The young man understood that his survival depended on maintaining the emperor's interest and satisfaction, but he also knew that such favor could disappear as quickly as it had appeared. The palace staff watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and horror. Some servants threw themselves into the project with enthusiasm, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to the emperor. Others went through the motions with obvious reluctance, uncomfortable with their role in what they saw as an abomination against nature and Roman tradition. The wedding dress. The centerpiece of Marcus's transformation was his wedding dress, a garment that would become legendary for its beauty and its symbolic significance. Caligula had commissioned the finest seamstresses in the empire to create something that would surpass even the most elaborate imperial regalia in its magnificence. The dress was made of silk so fine it seemed to float around Marcus's body like morning mist. The fabric had been dyed in shades of pearl and gold that shifted and changed as he moved, creating an otherworldly effect that suggested divine rather than mortal beauty. The bodice was embroidered with threads of real gold, depicting scenes of Venus and her attendants, while the skirt was decorated with pearls and precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. But the most shocking aspect of the dress was its design. It was cut to emphasize Marcus's slender build, while creating the illusion of feminine curves through clever tailoring and strategic padding. The neckline was low enough to be scandalous by Roman standards, while the flowing skirt concealed his masculine legs beneath layers of silk and gauze. The accompanying accessories were equally elaborate. A diadem of gold and pearls would crown his carefully arranged hair, while a veil of the finest silk would frame his face during the ceremony. Jewelry, worthy of an empress, necklaces, bracelets, and rings set with precious stones, would complete the transformation from young man to imperial bride. When Marcus first saw himself in the completed ensemble, he barely recognized the figure in the mirror. The young scribe who had once worked in the markets had been completely erased, replaced by a creature of such ethereal beauty that it seemed to belong more to the realm of gods than mortals. The rehearsals. As the wedding day approached, Caligula insisted on elaborate rehearsals that would ensure the ceremony proceeded without any embarrassing mistakes. These practice sessions took place in the palace's grandest hall, with servants playing the roles of guests and officials, while Marcus and the emperor went through the motions of their upcoming nuptials. The rehearsals were torture for Marcus, who was forced to practice walking in his elaborate dress, speaking his vows in a voice that had been trained to be softer and more melodious, and responding to Caligula's touches and caresses with appropriate feminine submission. Every gesture, every expression, every word was scrutinized and corrected until it met the emperor's exacting standards. Remember, Caligula would instruct, "You are not just my bride, but my empress. You must move with grace, speak with sweetness, and conduct yourself with the dignity befitting your new station." The emperor had written the wedding vows himself, creating a ceremony that combined traditional Roman marriage rituals with elements borrowed from mystery religions and Eastern mysticism. Marcus would promise not only to love and obey his husband, but to serve as his divine consort, sharing in the emperor's godlike status and helping to rule the empire through feminine wisdom and beauty. The psychological toll of these rehearsals was enormous. Marcus found himself losing track of his original identity, becoming so immersed in the role of imperial bride that he sometimes forgot who he had been before his adoption. The constant performance was wearing away his sense of self, replacing it with something artificial and hollow. The palace. Reactions news of the upcoming wedding had spread throughout the palace and beyond, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that affected everyone from the highest senators to the lowest slaves. The reaction was overwhelmingly negative, with most Romans viewing the planned ceremony as an abomination that violated every principle of traditional morality and religious propriety. The Senate was in chaos, with various factions debating how to respond to an emperor who seemed determined to destroy every norm of Roman society. Some senators called for direct action to prevent the wedding, while others argued that any opposition would only provoke Caligula to even greater excesses. A few opportunistic politicians even suggested that the marriage might provide new opportunities for influence if they could position themselves as supporters of the new empress. The Praetorian Guard was equally divided, with some officers expressing loyalty to the emperor regardless of his personal choices, while others whispered about the need to protect Rome from a ruler who had clearly lost his mind. The situation was complicated by the fact that Caligula still commanded the personal loyalty of many soldiers who had served under his father, Germanicus, and remembered the imperial family's military glory. Religious authorities were perhaps the most horrified by the planned ceremony. The College of Pontiffs struggled to find precedents for blessing a marriage between two men, while traditional priests argued that such a union would bring divine wrath upon the empire. Some temples even began offering special sacrifices to appease the gods, who might be offended by the emperor's actions. The wedding day is approaching, and the tension in Rome is reaching a breaking point. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will shock the ancient world. The foreign delegations as news of the wedding spread beyond Rome's borders. Foreign kingdoms and client states found themselves in the awkward position of deciding how to respond to their imperial overlord's unprecedented announcement. Diplomatic protocol required them to send representatives to witness the ceremony, but many rulers were reluctant to appear to endorse what they saw as a violation of natural law. The solutions were as varied as the kingdoms themselves. Some sent minor officials with instructions to observe but not participate, while others dispatched elaborate delegations, bearing expensive gifts as a way of demonstrating their continued loyalty, regardless of their personal feelings about the marriage. A few brave rulers simply ignored the invitation entirely, risking imperial displeasure rather than appearing to sanction the ceremony. The most interesting response came from the Eastern kingdoms, where traditions of sacred kingship and divine marriage were more established. Several rulers sent messages congratulating Caligula on his upcoming union with a divine consort, interpreting the marriage in terms that made it more acceptable to their own cultural sensibilities. These foreign reactions added another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. Caligula was not just marrying his adopted son in defiance of Roman tradition. He was doing so before an international audience that would carry news of the ceremony to every corner of the known world. The final preparations, the week before the wedding, was marked by increasingly frantic preparations, as Caligula demanded perfection in every detail of the ceremony. The palace was transformed into a venue worthy of divine nuptials, with flowers imported from across the empire, decorations of gold and silk, an entertainment that would rival the greatest festivals in Roman history. Marcus spent these final days in a state of numb resignation, submitting to the endless fittings, rehearsals, and beauty treatments that were designed to make him the perfect imperial bride. His transformation was now so complete that even he had difficulty remembering the young man he had once been. The mirror showed him a creature of ethereal beauty, but one that felt increasingly disconnected from any authentic sense of self. The emperor, meanwhile, was in a state of manic excitement that alarmed even his closest advisors. Caligula spoke constantly about the wedding, making increasingly grandiose claims about its significance and the divine approval it would demonstrate. He seemed genuinely convinced that he was about to participate in a sacred ceremony that would elevate both him and Marcus to a new level of godlike status. The contrast between the emperor's enthusiasm and Marcus's resignation was stark and troubling. While Caligula saw the wedding as the culmination of his desires and the beginning of a new era, Marcus experienced it as the final destruction of his identity and the beginning of a life that would be entirely defined by another person's will. The wedding day arrives. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the gods themselves were blessing the unprecedented ceremony about to take place. The palace was a hive of activity as servants made final preparations, guests began arriving, and the principals prepared for their roles in what would become one of the most notorious events in Roman history. Marcus was awakened before dawn by a team of servants who had spent hours preparing him for his role as imperial bride. His hair was arranged in the most elaborate style yet attempted, held in place with golden pins, and decorated with pearls and flowers. His face was painted with cosmetics that enhanced his natural beauty, while creating an otherworldly perfection that seemed almost divine. The wedding dress, when finally brought to his chambers, was even more magnificent than he had remembered. The silk seemed to glow with its own inner light, while the gold embroidery and precious stones created patterns that shifted and changed as he moved. When the servants had finished dressing him and adjusting every fold in detail, Marcus looked in the mirror and saw a figure of such beauty that it seemed to belong in a temple rather than a palace. Caligula's own preparations were equally elaborate. The emperor wore robes of purple silk, so rich they seemed to absorb light, while his crown was a masterpiece of goldsmith's art that proclaimed his divine status to all who saw it. His face glowed with anticipation and satisfaction as he prepared to claim the prize he had spent months creating. The wedding procession began at noon, with the sound of trumpets and the scent of incense filling the air as the imperial party made its way through the palace corridors toward the great hall where the ceremony would take place. Marcus walked beside Caligula, his silk dress rustling softly with each step, his veil creating an aura of mystery and beauty that drew gasps from everyone who saw him. The great hall had been transformed into something that seemed to exist outside of normal reality. Columns were draped with silk and gold, while flowers from every corner of the empire filled the air with exotic fragrances. Statues of Venus and other gods associated with love and marriage stood in places of honor, while hundreds of candles created a warm golden light that made everything seem touched by divine presence. The guests who filled the hall represented every level of Roman society, from the highest senators to foreign dignitaries to artists and entertainers who had been invited to witness the spectacle. Their faces showed a mixture of fascination, horror, and careful neutrality as they watched the unprecedented ceremony unfold before them. As Marcus took his place beside Caligula at the altar, he could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. Some looked with genuine admiration for his beauty, others with disgust at what they saw as an abomination, and still others with the calculating interest of those who were already planning how to use this event for their own advantage. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of theatrical spectacle and religious innovation. Caligula had combined traditional Roman marriage rituals with elements borrowed from mystery religions, creating something that was both familiar and completely unprecedented. The ceremony began with invocations to Venus and other gods associated with love and marriage, asking for their blessing on this union between emperor and divine consort. Priests from various temples participated in the rituals, some enthusiastically and others with obvious reluctance. The exchange of vows was the emotional centerpiece of the ceremony. Caligula spoke with genuine passion about his love for Marcus and his determination to share his divine status with his chosen bride. His words were carefully crafted to present the marriage as a sacred union, blessed by the gods rather than a violation of natural law. Marcus's own vows were delivered in the soft, melodious voice he had been trained to use, promising love, obedience, and devotion to his imperial husband. The words felt foreign in his mouth, but he spoke them with the conviction necessary to maintain the illusion that this was a genuine love match rather than an elaborate performance. The exchange of rings was particularly symbolic. With Caligula, placing on Marcus's finger a band of gold set with a ruby that was said to contain divine power. Marcus, in turn, gave the emperor a ring that symbolized his submission and devotion to their union. The ceremony is reaching its climax. Stay subscribed, and comment below about what you think will happen when Rome sees its emperor's shocking wedding completed. The kiss and the crowd. The ceremony reached its climax when Caligula lifted Marcus's veil and kissed his new wife before the assembled crowd. The kiss was long and passionate, designed to demonstrate the emperor's genuine affection for his bride, while also establishing his dominance in their relationship. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and varied. Some guests applauded politely, either out of genuine approval or fear of showing displeasure. Others sat in stunned silence, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. A few traditionalist senators looked physically ill, while some of the younger courtiers seemed genuinely moved by the spectacle. Foreign dignitaries watched with the careful neutrality of diplomats who understood that their reactions would be closely scrutinized and reported back to their home kingdoms. The ceremony they were witnessing would become part of the historical record, and their presence would be interpreted as either endorsement or condemnation, depending on the political needs of future historians. As the kiss ended and Caligula presented his new empress to the crowd, Marcus felt a strange sense of detachment from the proceedings. He was simultaneously the center of attention and completely powerless, the star of the show and merely a prop in someone else's performance. The wedding feast. The ceremony was followed by a banquet that surpassed even Caligula's usual standards for extravagance. The dining hall was decorated with silk and gold, while the tables groaned under the weight of delicacies imported from every corner of the empire. Wine flowed freely, entertainment was provided by the finest performers in Rome, and the atmosphere was one of forced celebration. Marcus, now officially the emperor's wife, was seated in the place of honor beside Caligula's throne. His every movement was watched and analyzed by the other guests, who were trying to understand what this new development meant for the future of the empire. Some attempted to curry favor with the new empress, while others maintained a careful distance. The emperor himself was in a state of euphoric satisfaction, frequently touching Marcus's hand or whispering endearments in his ear. Caligula seemed genuinely convinced that he had achieved something miraculous, creating a perfect companion who would share his divine status and help him rule the empire. But beneath the surface celebration, tensions were running high. Many of the guests were deeply uncomfortable with what they had witnessed, while others were already calculating how to use the situation to their own advantage. The marriage had created new possibilities for both advancement and destruction in the treacherous world of imperial politics. The wedding night as the evening wore on and the feast reached its conclusion, the moment arrived that Marcus had been dreading since his adoption, the traditional escorting of bride and groom to their marriage chamber. The procession was accompanied by the usual ribald songs and jokes, but the humor had a forced quality that reflected the unprecedented nature of the situation. The imperial bedchamber had been prepared as a shrine to their union, decorated with flowers, silk hangings, and burning incense that created an otherworldly atmosphere. Portraits of Venus and other love goddesses adorned the walls, while the bed itself was draped in silk, the color of pearls and roses. What transpired in that chamber would remain a secret between emperor and empress. But the palace staff reported hearing sounds throughout the night that suggested both passion and distress. Caligula's voice could be heard alternately tender and demanding, while Marcus's responses were too quiet to be clearly understood. The morning after would bring new challenges and new horrors as the reality of Marcus's new position became clear to everyone in the palace and beyond. The morning after dawn brought a harsh return to reality for the new imperial couple. Marcus awoke to find himself still wearing the remnants of his wedding dress, his carefully arranged hair disheveled, his cosmetics smeared. The beautiful bride of the previous evening had been replaced by a young man who looked exhausted and deeply shaken by his experiences. Caligula, meanwhile, seemed energized by the consummation of his desires. The emperor spoke enthusiastically about their future together, making plans for public appearances, state ceremonies, and the role that Marcus would play as his divine consort and "You are no longer merely my wife," Caligula declared as servants helped Marcus prepare for the day ahead. "You are my empress, my equal in all things divine and earthly. Rome will learn to worship you as they worship me." The transformation of Marcus from adopted son to imperial wife was now complete. But the young man who had once worked as a scribe in the markets was gone forever. In his place was a creature of artificial beauty whose very existence depended on maintaining the illusion that he was something he could never truly be. The empire's reaction news of the completed wedding spread throughout the Roman Empire with unprecedented speed, carried by merchants, soldiers, and official messengers who could barely believe what they were reporting. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative, with riots breaking out in several cities and provincial governors struggling to maintain order. In Rome itself, the mood was one of shocked disbelief mixed with growing anger. The people who had once cheered Caligula's accession to power now saw him as a madman who had violated every principle of Roman tradition and morality. Graffiti appeared on walls throughout the city, mocking the empress and her imperial husband. The Senate was thrown into chaos as senators debated how to respond to an emperor who had clearly crossed every line of acceptable behavior. Some called for immediate action to remove Caligula from power, while others argued that any opposition would only provoke him to greater excesses. The military reaction was perhaps the most dangerous. Several legions in the provinces began to question their loyalty to an emperor who had so thoroughly abandoned Roman values, while the Praetorian Guard found itself divided between duty and disgust. The beginning of the end. The wedding that was supposed to demonstrate Caligula's divine status and unlimited power had instead revealed the depth of his madness and the fragility of his position. The emperor, who had once seemed invincible, was now seen as a dangerous lunatic whose continued rule threatened the stability of the entire empire. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a role that was both exalted and degrading, powerful and powerless. As the emperor's wife, he had access to wealth and influence beyond his wildest dreams. But he also lived under constant scrutiny from a husband whose moods were notoriously unpredictable. The young man who had once dreamed of advancement through intelligence and hard work had achieved a position beyond his imagination, but at the cost of everything that had made him who he was. The beautiful empress who graced Caligula's side was a hollow creation, a living doll designed to fulfill an emperor's fantasies. This incredible story of power, obsession, and transformation shows us the darkest depths of imperial Rome. Sure, you're subscribed for more shocking tales from the ancient world. Comment below about what you think will happen to Marcus and Caligula. Can this twisted marriage survive, or will it destroy them both? Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. The marble halls of the palace where this extraordinary drama unfolded still echo with the ghosts of that impossible wedding. Though nearly 2,000 years have passed, the story of Caligula and Marcus continues to fascinate and horrify us, reminding us that absolute power can corrupt absolutely, and that love, or what passes for love, can become the most dangerous force of all, when wielded by those who recognize no limits to their desires. The beautiful young man who became an emperor's wife would face trials that would test not only his survival instincts, but his very sanity. The empire that witnessed their wedding would soon learn that some spectacles are too shocking even for Rome, and that even the most powerful rulers must eventually face the consequences of their actions.